I'm a graveyard security guard, and someone keeps unlocking the coffins. The first time I found an unlocked coffin, I thought it was a prank, maybe some drunk teenagers messing around in Evergreen Memorial Cemetery after hours, but when I saw the scratch marks on the inside of the lid and the torn fabric where fingernails had clawed desperately at satin lining, I knew something far more terrifying was happening in this place. My name is Marcus Chen, and I've been working cemetery security for 12 years, first at smaller memorial parks around Seattle, then finally landing this position at Evergreen Memorial, one of the oldest and most prestigious cemeteries in Washington state, a sprawling 200-acre property that houses over 80,000 graves dating back to 1873, including senators, governors, and some of the wealthiest families in the Pacific Northwest. Cemetery security isn't like mall security or even warehouse security. It requires specialized knowledge of burial practices, familiarity with funeral home protocols, understanding of state regulations regarding human remains, and most importantly, the ability to handle situations that would send most people running. Because when you're alone at 3 in the morning and you hear sounds coming from beneath the ground, there's no backup coming for at least 20 minutes. I started at Evergreen on October 15, replacing a guard named Rodriguez who had quit suddenly after 17 years on the job, leaving only a brief resignation letter that mentioned family issues, though the day shift supervisor, Janet, told me in confidence that Rodriguez had been acting strange his last few weeks, talking about movements in the older sections of the cemetery and insisting that some of the Victorian-era mausoleums had been tampered with. The cemetery is divided into 12 sections, each with its own character and history, from the modern Garden of Remembrance with its flat bronze markers and carefully manicured lawn, to the ancient pioneer section where weathered headstones lean at odd angles and massive oak trees create a canopy so thick that even moonlight struggles to penetrate, and it was in Section 7, the area known as Whispering Pines, where I made my first disturbing discovery. It was my third week on the job, November 4th, around 2:30 in the morning during my standard patrol route, when my flashlight beam caught something unusual near the Ashford family plot, a collection of elaborate marble monuments surrounded by a wrought iron fence that had been installed in 1891, and as I approached, I noticed that the groundskeeper's tool shed nearby had its door hanging open, the padlock cut clean through with what looked like industrial bolt cutters. Inside the shed, several shovels were missing, along with a pickaxe and a crowbar, tools that could be used for only one purpose in a cemetery, and my blood ran cold as I realized someone might be attempting to rob graves, a federal crime that carries serious prison time, but as I called it in on my radio and began searching the area, what I found was far worse than any grave robbery. The Ashford family patriarch, Cornelius Ashford, had been buried in 1923 in an elaborate bronze coffin with a hermetic seal designed to last centuries, but when I shined my light on his grave, I saw fresh dirt scattered across the normally pristine grass, and the marble slab that covered the burial vault had been shifted several inches, revealing a gap just wide enough for someone to have accessed the coffin below. Protocol demanded that I wait for police backup before investigating further, but something compelled me to look closer. Maybe it was professional curiosity or maybe it was the strange smell emanating from the gap, not the smell of decay which I had unfortunately encountered before during flooding incidents, but something else, something chemical and wrong, like formaldehyde mixed with sulfur and ozone. I knelt beside the displaced slab and directed my flashlight beam into the darkness below, immediately recoiling at what I saw, because the coffin lid was not just open but completely removed, leaning against the concrete wall of the burial vault, and the silk lining inside was shredded as if by claws, with long gouges in the bronze itself that no human fingernails could have made. The body of Cornelius Ashford was gone, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the message scratched into the bottom of the coffin in letters so deep they had gouged through the metal, letters that spelled out a single word that made my hands shake as I read it by flashlight: returning. When the police arrived 20 minutes later, led by Detective Sarah Walsh, a veteran investigator who specialized in cemetery crimes, they treated it as a standard grave robbing case despite my protests about the scratch marks and the message, and Detective Walsh explained that grave robbers often left theatrical touches to throw off investigations, though I could see in her eyes that even she was disturbed by the claw marks. The investigation team spent hours photographing the scene, dusting for fingerprints that yielded nothing, and eventually removing the entire coffin as evidence, while I provided my statement and tried to explain the feeling of wrongness that permeated the entire area. a sensation like static electricity mixed with the pressure you feel before a severe thunderstorm. But Detective Walsh just nodded and suggested I might be experiencing shock from discovering my first crime scene. Over the next 3 days, I couldn't shake the image of those claw marks, and I began researching the Ashford family during my off hours, discovering that Cornelius had been a wealthy industrialist who made his fortune in logging but was also known for his interest in the occult, specifically in what newspaper accounts from the 1920s called resurrection sciences and communication with the departed, interests that had apparently led to his expulsion from several prominent social clubs. The Seattle Historical Society archives contain dozens of references to Cornelius Ashford, including a particularly disturbing account from 1922, the year before his death, describing how he had funded an expedition to Haiti to study what he called the boundary between life and death, returning with several crates of artifacts and manuscripts that he kept in a private laboratory beneath his Capitol Hill mansion, a mansion that had burned to the ground 3 days after his funeral, taking all his research with it. On November 9, 5 days after the first incident, I was doing my regular 2 a.m. patrol when my radio crackled with an urgent call from Tom Bradley, the other night guard who covered the eastern sections of the cemetery, his voice tight with barely controlled panic as he reported another open grave in Section 4, the Catholic section known as Holy Cross Gardens, where the Delacroix family mausoleum stood like a miniature cathedral among more modest headstones. The Delacroix Mausoleum was a limestone structure built in 1897, designed to house 24 family members in individual crypts, and when I arrived, Tom was standing outside, his face pale in the beam of my flashlight, pointing with a shaking hand at the bronze doors that should have been locked with a mechanism that hadn't been opened since the last Delacroix burial in 1987. The doors were not just unlocked but hanging off their hinges as if something had burst through them from the inside, and the lock mechanism itself was twisted and broken, the thick bronze warped in a way that suggested incredible force that no crowbar or even a car jack could have produced, and as we entered the mausoleum, our flashlights revealed a scene that made the Ashford incident look tame by comparison. 3 of the crypts had been opened from the inside, their marble facades shattered outward in a spray of debris that covered the mausoleum floor, and the coffins within were empty, their lids thrown open and their interiors bearing the same desperate claw marks I had seen before, but this time there were more messages, scratched into the walls in what looked like fingernails but couldn't have been, messages that read awakening and hungry and most disturbingly, more coming. Tom was hyperventilating, leaning against the doorframe and muttering prayers in Spanish, while I forced myself to document everything with my phone camera, knowing the police would need evidence, and that's when I noticed something else, a pattern in the debris that suggested the 3 bodies had left the crypts at different times, with the oldest crypt showing the most weathering around the breaks, as if it had been opened days or even weeks ago. Detective Walsh arrived with a full forensics team and the medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Nguyen, who took one look at the scene and immediately called for hazmat protocols, explaining that grave robberies involving multiple bodies could indicate black market organ harvesting or illegal medical research, though even she couldn't explain the claw marks or the fact that the crypts had clearly been opened from the inside. The investigation expanded to include the FBI, who brought in specialists in organized crime and human trafficking, but I knew they were looking in the wrong direction, because I had started to notice other things during my patrols, subtle changes that wouldn't mean anything to investigators who didn't walk these grounds every night, like the way certain graves had slight depressions as if the soil had settled, or how the temperature dropped dramatically near specific plots, or the scratching sounds I sometimes heard that seemed to come from underground. I began keeping a detailed log of anomalies, documenting everything in a notebook that I carried constantly, and by November 15, I had identified 17 graves that showed signs of disturbance, all of them dating from the 1920s or earlier, all of them belonging to wealthy families with connections to what the historical records carefully termed esoteric interests or unconventional scientific pursuits, and all of them in sections of the cemetery where the night security cameras mysteriously malfunctioned. On November 18, I made a decision that probably violated a dozen employment policies and several laws, but I had to know what was happening, so I arrived at work 3 hours early, while there was still daylight, and made my way to the cemetery's administrative building where the historical burial records were kept, records that went back to the cemetery's founding and included not just names and dates but also burial specifics and family histories. The records clerk, an elderly woman named Margaret who had worked at Evergreen for 40 years, was surprisingly helpful when I explained I was researching historical burial practices for a community college course, and she gave me access to the archive room, a climate-controlled basement filled with leather-bound ledgers and filing cabinets that smelled of old paper and preservation chemicals. What I found in those records changed everything I thought I knew about Evergreen Memorial Cemetery, because starting in 1919 and continuing through 1923, there had been a series of unusual burials, all involving wealthy individuals who had specified bizarre requirements in their funeral arrangements, requirements that included special chemical preparations of their bodies, non-standard coffin materials, and most disturbing of all, the installation of what the records called revival bells. Mechanical devices connected to the coffins that could be rung from inside in case of premature burial. The revival bell system was not unusual in itself, as the fear of being buried alive was common in the Victorian era, but these particular bells were different, connected not to simple mechanical pulls but to complex electrical systems powered by batteries that were supposed to last decades, and according to the maintenance records, several of these bells had been tested as recently as the 1980s and found to still be functional. Margaret noticed my interest in the revival bells and mentioned that her predecessor had told her stories about the bell tower, a small structure in the old section of the cemetery that had once housed the central monitoring system for all the revival bells, a system that had been disconnected in 1954 after what the records only referred to as the incident, though no details were provided about what this incident actually was. That night, I couldn't resist investigating the bell tower, which stood in Section 9 near the old caretaker's cottage that had been abandoned since the 1960s, and as I approached the structure, a hexagonal building made of stone with a peaked roof and narrow windows, I felt that familiar sensation of wrongness, that electric pressure that I had come to associate with the disturbed graves. The door to the bell tower was locked with a modern padlock, but the wood around the hasp was rotted and gave way easily when I applied pressure with my shoulder, and inside, my flashlight revealed a circular room with a spiral staircase leading up to a platform where dozens of wires hung from the ceiling, each one labeled with a small brass plate bearing a name and plot number. Most of the wires were cut or corroded beyond recognition, but 7 of them looked newer, as if they had been repaired or replaced, and when I traced their labels back to my notebook, I felt my blood turn to ice, because these 7 wires corresponded exactly to 7 of the 17 disturbed graves I had documented, including the Ashford plot and the 3 Delacroix crypts. I climbed the spiral staircase to get a better look at where the wires led, and at the top, I found a mechanical panel with 7 small bells arranged in a row, each one connected to one of the newer wires, and beneath each bell was a counter showing how many times it had been activated, counters that should have shown zeros but instead displayed numbers that made no sense. Numbers like 1847 and 2391 and 4762. As I stood there trying to process what these numbers could mean, one of the bells began to ring, a thin, metallic sound that sent chills down my spine, and the counter beneath it clicked from 3241 to 3242, and then another bell joined it, and another, until all 7 bells were ringing in a discordant chorus that seemed to echo not just in the tower but in my bones. I ran from the bell tower and didn't stop until I reached my security vehicle, where I sat with the doors locked and the engine running, trying to convince myself that what I had seen and heard could be explained rationally, that the bells were malfunctioning due to age or atmospheric conditions, but deep down I knew that something was systematically awakening in Evergreen Memorial Cemetery, something that had been sleeping since the 1920s. The next morning, I called in sick and spent the day at the Seattle Public Library, researching everything I could find about the period from 1919 to 1923, and what I discovered was a pattern of deaths among Seattle's wealthy elite, all of whom had been members of something called the Thanatos Society, a group dedicated to what they called the conquest of death through scientific means. The Thanatos Society had been founded by a doctor named Elias Blackwood, whose medical license had been revoked in 1918 for conducting unauthorized experiments on terminal patients, experiments that supposedly involved a combination of electrical stimulation, chemical preservation, and what one contemporary account described as procedures too disturbing to print in a family newspaper. Dr. Blackwood had convinced his wealthy patrons that death was merely a state of suspended animation that could be reversed with the proper application of scientific principles, and he had developed a process that he claimed would preserve the body in a state of readiness for revival. A process that involved injecting the deceased with a proprietary mixture of chemicals and installing electrical conductors at key points in the nervous system. The Society's activities had come to an abrupt end in December 1923 when Dr. Blackwood himself died under mysterious circumstances, found in his laboratory with injuries that the coroner described as inconsistent with any known cause of death, injuries that included massive tissue damage and bone fractures that suggested he had been crushed by tremendous pressure, though no mechanism for such pressure could be found in the room. After Blackwood's death, the remaining members of the Thanatos Society had all died within 6 months, each one requesting burial according to Blackwood's specifications, and each one interred at Evergreen Memorial Cemetery in coffins equipped with the special revival bell systems, coffins that were now being found empty, their occupants apparently gone after nearly a century of sleep. That night, despite every instinct telling me to stay away, I returned to work, because I needed to know if my theories were correct, and I needed to be there when whatever was happening reached its crescendo, so I armed myself with every piece of equipment I could think of, including a high-powered flashlight, a digital camera with night vision capabilities, and a voice recorder to document whatever I might encounter. The cemetery felt different as soon as I passed through the gates, the air heavy with that electrical sensation I had come to dread, and as I began my patrol, I noticed that the security cameras were malfunctioning all across the property, their feeds showing nothing but static, while my radio produced only white noise when I tried to check in with Tom on the other side of the grounds. At midnight, I was near Section 5, the area called Garden of Eternal Rest, when I heard the sound that confirmed all my worst fears, the sound of soil being displaced from below, not the sound of someone digging down but of something digging up, and as I ran toward the source, my flashlight beam caught movement among the headstones, movement that was wrong in every possible way. The figure that emerged from behind the Morrison family monument was humanoid in shape but moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, as if it was relearning how to use its limbs, and its clothes, the remnants of what had once been an expensive burial suit, hung in tatters from a frame that seemed both emaciated and somehow swollen, as if the tissues beneath had been transformed by whatever process Dr. Blackwood had used. When it turned toward my light, I saw a face that had once been human but was now something else entirely, the skin with a waxy, translucent quality that showed dark veins beneath, eyes that were milky white but somehow still capable of focusing on me with predatory intensity, and a mouth that opened far wider than any human mouth should, revealing teeth that had grown long and sharp during its decades underground. I stumbled backward, my training and rational mind completely overwhelmed by the impossibility of what I was seeing, and that's when I heard more sounds of emergence, from all around me, as if my presence had triggered some kind of mass awakening, and I realized with growing horror that all 17 of the graves I had documented were now active. The thing that had been human took a step toward me, its movements becoming more fluid with each passing second, and when it spoke, its voice was like grinding stone mixed with the whistle of air through damaged vocal cords, saying words that I'll never forget, words that haunt me still. We have been waiting, the doctor promised us eternity, and now we are hungry, so very hungry for what the living possess. I ran then, abandoning all pretense of professional duty, sprinting between headstones and vaulting over low fences as more figures emerged from the earth behind me, their pursuit relentless but still clumsy, as if they were operating bodies that had been dormant too long, bodies that Dr. Blackwood's process had preserved but fundamentally changed. My security vehicle was parked near the main office, and I had almost reached it when I saw Tom's truck sideways across the access road, the driver's door hanging open and the interior light casting a weak glow that illuminated dark stains on the seat, stains that could only be blood, and I knew with terrible certainty that Tom had encountered these things before I had. I veered away from the vehicles, knowing they would be too slow to navigate the cemetery's narrow roads with those things in pursuit, and instead headed for the maintenance building, a reinforced concrete structure that might offer some protection, but as I rounded the corner of the building, I came face to face with Detective Walsh. She was standing perfectly still, her service weapon drawn but hanging loosely at her side, and when she turned to look at me, I saw that her eyes had the same milky quality as the thing from the Morrison plot, and her voice when she spoke was her own but underlaid with something else, something ancient and hungry. They got to me 3 nights ago, Marcus, when I was investigating the mausoleum alone. And now I understand what Blackwood discovered, that death is just a doorway, and something else lives on the other side. Before I could respond, she raised her weapon, not to shoot but to gesture behind me, where a group of at least a dozen figures had gathered, all in various states of decay and reconstruction, all moving with that same unnatural gait, and all focused on me with an intensity that suggested I was the only truly living thing in their field of perception. I backed against the maintenance building wall, frantically searching for any escape route, when the building's door opened behind me and a hand grabbed my shoulder, pulling me inside with surprising strength, and I found myself face to face with Rodriguez, the guard who had quit before I started, but who was clearly still here, living in the maintenance building like some kind of survivor in a zombie movie. Rodriguez slammed the door and threw multiple deadbolts, then turned to me with eyes that were haunted but thankfully still human, and said, "I've been hiding here for 3 weeks, ever since I realized what was happening, and I've learned some things about them, about what Blackwood did and what they need, and if we're going to survive the night, you need to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you." He led me deeper into the building, past stored equipment and supplies, to a room he had converted into a makeshift command center, with monitors showing feeds from hidden cameras he had installed, maps of the cemetery covered in red marks indicating emergence sites, and stacks of research materials that made my own investigation look amateur by comparison. According to Rodriguez, the Thanatos Society hadn't just been seeking immortality but had made contact with something else, something that existed in the space between life and death, and Blackwood's process didn't preserve the original person but created a vessel for these entities to inhabit, entities that fed on life force and grew stronger with each feeding. The revival bells weren't warning devices but summoning mechanisms, designed to activate when conditions were right for the entities to emerge, and those conditions had finally been met after a century of waiting, triggered by something Rodriguez believed was connected to the current lunar cycle and electromagnetic fluctuations in the Earth's field that occurred only once every 97 years. Outside, we could hear them gathering, dozens of them now, scratching at the walls and testing the doors, and Rodriguez showed me footage from his hidden cameras of similar scenes playing out across the cemetery, empty graves everywhere, figures emerging and converging on our location, drawn by the concentration of life force that 2 living humans represented. Rodriguez had stockpiled supplies and weapons, not guns which he had learned were useless against things that didn't truly live, but industrial equipment like acetylene torches and circular saws, tools that could dismember and disable even if they couldn't kill, and he had discovered that extreme heat seemed to disrupt whatever force animated them, causing them to retreat at least temporarily. As we prepared our defenses, Rodriguez told me about the first night he had encountered them, how he had found a security camera reviewing footage of a grave opening from the inside, how he had investigated and barely escaped, and how he had spent the following nights tracking their movements and learning their patterns, patterns that suggested they were not random revenants but organized entities with a purpose. That purpose, he believed, was to complete Blackwood's work, to open a permanent gateway between their realm and ours, and according to the documents he had found in the cemetery's oldest archives, such a gateway required a specific number of vessels that had been prepared according to Blackwood's process, and once all 49 members of the Thanatos Society had emerged, the ritual could begin. We had counted 43 emerged graves so far, meaning 6 more were still dormant, and Rodriguez had identified their locations, all clustered in Section 13, the oldest part of the cemetery where Blackwood himself was buried in an unmarked grave, a grave that Rodriguez believed was the focal point for whatever ritual was planned. As if responding to our discussion, the scratching at the walls intensified, and then we heard a voice, amplified somehow to carry throughout the building, the voice of Detective Walsh but speaking words that no human throat should be able to pronounce, words in a language that predated any earthly tongue, words that seemed to vibrate in our bones and make our teeth ache. The monitors showed them surrounding the building completely now, at least 60 figures in various states of preservation, some looking almost normal except for their eyes and movements, others showing decades of decay despite Blackwood's process, and at their center stood 3 figures in robes that looked ceremonial, robes that Rodriguez identified as belonging to the inner circle of the Thanatos Society. One of the robed figures raised its arms, and all the others stopped moving, freezing in place like mannequins, and then it spoke in English, its voice carrying despite the concrete walls between us, guards of the living, you have witnessed our awakening, and now you must choose, join us willingly and become vessels for the Eternal Ones, or resist and feed our hunger as your companion Tom did. The choice is yours, but the outcome is inevitable. Rodriguez looked at me, his face grim but determined, and said, "There's another way out, an old tunnel system that connects to the city storm drains, but we'll have to go through the basement, and I can't guarantee it hasn't been compromised, but staying here means certain death or worse, so I say we take our chances below." We gathered what supplies we could carry, including 2 acetylene torches, emergency flares, and a crowbar each. Then Rodriguez led me to a service hatch I hadn't even known existed, hidden behind a stack of old gravestones awaiting repair, and as we descended into darkness, the sounds of our pursuers grew muffled but didn't disappear entirely. The basement was a maze of pipes and electrical conduits, dimly lit by emergency lighting that cast long shadows perfect for concealing threats, and we moved as quietly as possible, Rodriguez leading with the confidence of someone who had explored these passages before, though his frequent glances over his shoulder betrayed his nervousness. We had made it about halfway to what Rodriguez said was the tunnel entrance when we heard movement ahead, a shuffling sound accompanied by breathing that was too wet and labored to be fully human, and our flashlights revealed Tom, or what remained of him, standing in the corridor with half his throat missing and his security uniform soaked in blood that looked black in the dim light. Tom's eyes were the same milky white as the others, but something in his expression suggested he was fighting whatever controlled him, and when he spoke, his voice was a barely audible whisper through his damaged throat, "Run, they're using me as a tracker, I can smell your life force, can't stop myself from following, but the tunnel is clear, Rodriguez knows the way, just run and don't look back." Rodriguez grabbed my arm and pulled me past Tom, who made no move to stop us but followed at a distance, that wet breathing echoing in the narrow passage, and we reached the tunnel entrance just as we heard the service hatch above us being torn open, metal screeching as inhuman strength ripped it from its hinges. The storm tunnel was ancient brick and concrete, part of Seattle's original sewer system from the 1890s, and Rodriguez led me through knee-deep water that smelled of rust and decay, our flashlights creating dancing shadows on the curved walls, shadows that too often seemed to move independently of our lights. Behind us, we could hear pursuit, not just Tom's labored shuffling but dozens of feet splashing through the water, and that chanting in the impossible language grew louder, reverberating through the tunnel system until it seemed to come from everywhere at once, from ahead and behind and even from the water itself. Rodriguez suddenly stopped, holding up his hand for silence, and in the relative quiet, we could hear something else, a rhythmic pounding like a massive heartbeat, coming from deeper in the tunnel system, from the direction we were heading, and Rodriguez's face went pale as he whispered, "They're not just chasing us, they're herding us toward something." Before we could decide whether to continue forward or try to find another route, the tunnel wall beside us exploded outward in a shower of brick and mortar, and through the gap came one of the robed figures, moving with impossible speed, its fingers elongated into claws that reached for Rodriguez. He brought the acetylene torch up just in time, the flame catching the thing's robes and spreading quickly to whatever preserved flesh lay beneath, and it reeled back with a sound like steam escaping from a broken pipe, but more were coming through the gap, and our only choice was to run toward whatever waited ahead. The tunnel opened into a large circular chamber that looked like some kind of maintenance junction, with multiple tunnels branching off in different directions, but our attention was immediately drawn to the center of the chamber, where a symbol had been carved into the floor, a symbol that hurt to look at directly and seemed to shift and writhe even though it was just carved stone. Standing around the symbol were the remaining members of the Thanatos Society's inner circle, including a figure in more elaborate robes who could only be Dr. Blackwood himself, his face a ruin of exposed bone and preserved tissue that somehow still managed to convey arrogant satisfaction as he looked at us. "Welcome," Blackwood said, his voice coming not from his destroyed throat but from the air around him, "witnesses to the culmination of a century's patience, you have the honor of observing the opening of the Eternal Gate, though I'm afraid you won't survive to speak of it, as your life force is precisely what we need to complete the ritual." Rodriguez raised his torch, but Blackwood merely gestured and the flame went out, along with our flashlights and every other source of light except for a sickly green glow emanating from the symbol on the floor, a glow that revealed dozens more figures emerging from the other tunnels, the full complement of the Thanatos Society. They arranged themselves in concentric circles around the symbol, and began chanting in that alien language, their voices harmonizing in ways that human vocal cords shouldn't allow, and the symbol began to pulse and expand, revealing that it wasn't carved into the floor but was actually a hole, a gap in reality itself that opened onto somewhere else. Through that gap, I glimpsed something that my mind still refuses to fully process, a vast space filled with writhing shadows and structures that defied geometry, and things that might have been alive in some incomprehensible way, things that pressed against the opening as if eager to cross over into our world. Rodriguez grabbed my arm and pointed to one of the exit tunnels, but as we moved toward it, Tom appeared, blocking our path, and this time there was no fighting the control, no whispered warnings, just those dead white eyes and reaching hands that dripped with water and darker fluids. In desperation, I struck out with the crowbar, catching Tom in the side of the head with a wet crunch that sent him sprawling, but he immediately began to rise again, bones visibly repositioning themselves beneath his skin, and I realized that whatever animated these things cared nothing for the physical laws that govern normal bodies. The chanting reached a crescendo, and the hole in reality widened, now large enough for something to start pushing through, something that looked like a hand but was made of shadow and possessed far too many joints, and Blackwood's laughter echoed through the chamber as he proclaimed that the Eternal Ones were finally arriving. That's when Rodriguez did something I'll never forget, something that saved my life but haunts me still. He pulled out a handful of emergency flares, lit them all at once, and threw himself directly at the expanding portal, screaming words in Spanish that sounded like prayers mixed with curses. The flares connected with whatever was pushing through the portal, and the reaction was immediate and violent, a shriek that wasn't heard but felt, a vibration that shattered brick and sent everyone in the chamber, living and unliving alike, to their knees, and the portal began to collapse, folding in on itself like origami in reverse. Blackwood's scream of rage was very much audible as he watched his century of planning dissolve, and he turned toward me with murder in his dead eyes, but the collapsing portal was creating some kind of vacuum effect, pulling at everything in the chamber, and the Thanatos Society members were being dragged toward it, their preserved bodies beginning to dissolve as whatever force animated them was reclaimed. I ran then, using the chaos to escape through one of the exit tunnels, not caring where it led as long as it was away from that chamber, and behind me, I could hear the sound of reality tearing itself apart, of stone and metal and flesh being pulled into somewhere else, somewhere that should never touch our world. The tunnel led eventually to a maintenance access near the waterfront, and I emerged into the pre-dawn darkness of Seattle, covered in filth and shaking with exhaustion and terror, but alive, and as I looked back toward Evergreen Memorial Cemetery, I could see lights, emergency vehicles responding to what the news would later call a massive sinkhole that had opened in the old section. The official story was that old mining tunnels had collapsed, taking several sections of the cemetery with them, including all of Section 13 and parts of the surrounding areas, and that 3 people were missing, security guards Tom Bradley and Manuel Rodriguez, and Detective Sarah Walsh, who had been investigating vandalism at the cemetery. Nobody mentioned the empty graves or the things that had emerged from them, and when I tried to tell my story, I was met with skepticism and eventually placed on administrative leave for psychological evaluation, which I failed spectacularly by insisting that everything I've told you here is true. I don't work cemetery security anymore, I can't, not when every shadow might hide something that shouldn't exist, not when every sound of settling earth makes me remember that night, and especially not when I know that the collapse didn't destroy everything, that some of the Thanatos Society members were in other parts of the cemetery when the portal fell. Sometimes, late at night, I search online for reports of unusual grave disturbances, for stories of empty coffins and scratch marks on the inside of lids, and I find more than you might think, scattered across the country, scattered across the world, and I wonder if Blackwood's process has spread, if there are other societies waiting for their own awakening. I've moved multiple times, but I still get calls sometimes, always at 3 in the morning, always from blocked numbers, and when I answer, I hear that wet breathing I remember from Tom, and a voice that might be his whispers a single word before the line goes dead, the same word I found scratched in Cornelius Ashford's coffin, returning. The cemetery has been closed since that night, officially for renovation and safety concerns, but I've driven past it, and I've seen the new security measures, the concrete barriers, the federal warning signs, the kind of containment you don't use for a simple sinkhole, and I know that someone, somewhere, believes my story even if they'll never admit it publicly. I write this account not for vindication but as a warning, because if you ever take a job as cemetery security, if you ever find yourself walking among the graves in the deep hours of the night, pay attention to the signs, the disturbed earth, the temperature drops, the sounds from below, and if you find an open coffin with claw marks on the inside, don't investigate, don't follow protocol, just run. Run, and don't stop running until you're far from any cemetery, far from any place where the dead are supposed to rest, because sometimes they don't rest, sometimes they're just waiting, and sometimes what comes back isn't what was buried, but something else entirely, something that has learned to wear human faces and speak with human voices while serving masters that have never been human at all. I know Rodriguez is gone, pulled into whatever dimension existed beyond that portal, but sometimes I dream that he succeeded, that his sacrifice closed the gate permanently, that the Eternal Ones are locked away forever, but then I remember Blackwood's final words as the portal collapsed, words that echo in my nightmares still. He said, "You've only delayed us, the conditions will align again, the bells will ring again, and next time, there will be no one left who knows how to stop us, no one who remembers the old ways or understands what we truly are, and we have nothing but time, all the time in the world and beyond." I've researched everything I can about the Thanatos Society, about Dr. Blackwood's methods, about the specific chemicals and procedures he used, hoping to find some way to permanently prevent another awakening, but the fire that destroyed his mansion took most of his research, and what remains is scattered across private collections and university archives, fragments that make little sense without the whole. What I have learned is that Blackwood wasn't the first to attempt this kind of resurrection science, that throughout history there have been individuals and groups who sought to breach the barrier between life and death, from the ancient Egyptian priests who developed mummification to preserve bodies for the afterlife, to medieval alchemists who believed the philosopher's stone could grant eternal life, to modern scientists who study cryonics and cellular regeneration. But Blackwood was different because he succeeded, at least partially, in creating vessels that could house consciousness from beyond death, though what came back to inhabit those vessels was not the original person but something else, something that viewed human bodies as mere containers and human souls as food, something that had been waiting on the other side for someone foolish enough to open the door. The chemicals he used were partially based on formulas he discovered in those Haitian manuscripts, combined with his own knowledge of early 20th century medicine and electrical theory, creating a preservation matrix that kept tissues viable for decades while also making them receptive to otherworldly influence, a process that turned corpses into receivers tuned to frequencies from beyond. I found references to similar experiments in other cities, always ending in disaster, fire, or mysterious disappearances, and always leaving behind stories of things that wouldn't stay buried, of cemetery workers who quit without explanation, of funeral homes that closed after incidents no one would discuss, a hidden history of humanity's attempts to conquer death and death's response. The revival bells were perhaps the most ingenious and terrible part of Blackwood's system, because they weren't just mechanical devices but conductors for something he called thanatic energy, a force that accumulated over time in properly prepared bodies, building like electrical charge until it reached a critical mass that could punch through the veil between worlds. Each ring of those bells was actually a pulse of this energy, a signal sent not just through copper wires but through dimensions we can't perceive, and when enough bells rang in synchronization, when enough bodies reached the proper charge level, they created a resonance that opened gateways that let in things that should never walk in our world. I've calculated the pattern, the 97-year cycle Rodriguez mentioned, and I've found correlations with solar activity, lunar phases, and electromagnetic anomalies recorded by various observatories, all pointing to specific windows when the barrier between worlds grows thin, when the right conditions make Blackwood's process viable, and the next window is only 18 years away. 18 years might seem like a long time, but I've learned that others are preparing, that there are groups who see Blackwood not as a cautionary tale but as a pioneer, who study his methods and seek to improve upon them, groups with access to modern technology and resources Blackwood could only dream of, groups who think they can control what comes through. I've tried to warn authorities, but who would believe such a story, who would take seriously the idea that certain funeral practices could open doorways to hostile dimensions, that the dead could be turned into weapons against the living, that beneath our feet in cemeteries around the world, things might be waiting for their moment to rise. So I've become something of an investigator myself, tracking unusual burial patterns, monitoring reports of cemetery disturbances, building a network of contacts among security guards, groundskeepers, and funeral directors who have seen things they can't explain, people who whisper about bodies that move in their coffins, about preservation techniques that seem too effective, about families with strange requests for their deceased. Last month, I received a package with no return address, containing a single page from what appeared to be Blackwood's personal journal, written in his distinctive hand, describing an experiment he called the Greater Working, something beyond individual resurrections, something that would transform death itself from an ending to a beginning, from a barrier to a bridge. The page was water-damaged and partially illegible, but I could make out references to a master grave, a specially prepared burial site that would serve as an anchor point for a permanent gateway, a grave that would need to be fed with specific energies over decades before it could activate, and according to his notes, he had prepared several such sites as insurance against failure. I've been searching for these master graves, using the clues in that journal page and my own knowledge of Blackwood's methods, and I believe I've found one, in a small rural cemetery in Oregon, a grave with no name, just a number that corresponds to one of Blackwood's experimental codes, a grave that shows signs of recent disturbance despite being over a century old. The local caretaker, an old man named Franklin, told me stories about that grave, about how animals avoid it, how grass won't grow on it properly, how previous caretakers have reported hearing sounds from below, not knocking or scratching but something like breathing, deep, patient breathing, as if something large is sleeping underneath and slowly waking up. Franklin also mentioned that several other unmarked graves in the cemetery have similar characteristics, all arranged in a pattern that looked random until I mapped it out and realized they formed a perfect geometric shape, a shape I recognized from the symbol on the floor of that Seattle tunnel, a shape that hurt to look at even on paper. I've considered trying to destroy these graves, to dig them up and burn whatever lies within, but I remember what happened when Rodriguez threw those flares into the portal, how violence seemed to accelerate the process rather than stop it, and I fear that disturbing these sites might trigger exactly what they were designed to do. Instead, I document everything, building a comprehensive record of Blackwood's work and its consequences, hoping that someone smarter than me, someone with resources and authority, will eventually take this seriously and find a permanent solution, because the alternative is too terrible to contemplate. The alternative is that one day, in 18 years or sooner if someone accelerates the process, graves will open across the world simultaneously, and what emerges won't be the stumbling, newly awakened things I encountered in Seattle but entities that have had decades to prepare, to grow strong on whatever energies they absorb in their buried state, to plan and coordinate their return. I think about Tom sometimes, about that moment when he fought against the control long enough to warn us, and I wonder if some part of the original person survives the transformation, trapped inside while something else uses their body, aware but helpless, and that might be the worst horror of all, not just that the dead can return but that they return as prisoners in their own flesh. Detective Walsh called me once, 3 months after that night, or at least something using her voice did, and it told me things about the other side, about the entities that wait there, about their hunger that spans eons and their patience that makes human lifespans seem like eye blinks, about their need for physical forms to anchor themselves in our reality. She, or it, said that Blackwood had been chosen, that the knowledge hadn't come from Haiti but through Haiti, from sources much older and farther away, that humans had always been intended as vessels, that our evolution itself had been guided to make us suitable containers, and that death was just the ripening process that prepared us for harvest. I hung up on her, but her words stayed with me, the implications burrowing into my thoughts like parasites, making me question everything from human history to the nature of consciousness itself, because if she was right, if we were designed as vessels, then who or what did the designing, and for what ultimate purpose? The nightmares have never stopped, and they've gotten more specific over time, showing me visions of mass resurrections, of entire cemeteries emptying at once, of cities overrun by things wearing human faces but serving alien masters, of a world where death is no longer an escape but just another form of enslavement. In these dreams, I see Rodriguez sometimes, not dead but transformed into something else, something that guards the spaces between worlds, and he tells me that the sacrifice is never ending, that he holds the gate closed through constant effort, but that he grows weaker while what pushes from the other side grows stronger. I've made preparations for when the next window opens, gathered supplies and weapons, identified safe houses and escape routes, built a network of people who know the truth and are ready to act, because I refuse to be caught unprepared again, refuse to let another security guard stumble into horror without warning. My apartment is filled with maps marking cemetery locations, historical records of unusual burials, scientific papers on preservation techniques and electromagnetic anomalies, occult texts that might hold clues to understanding Blackwood's process, and always, that photo I took of the scratch marks inside Cornelius Ashford's coffin, proof that I'm not insane. Sometimes young people contact me, usually security guards or mortuary students who have seen something they can't explain, and I tell them this story. Watch their faces change from skepticism to fear to determination, and I know that at least some of them will be ready when the time comes, will know what to look for and how to respond. The corporation that owns Evergreen Memorial has offered me substantial money to sign a non-disclosure agreement, to officially retract my statements and attribute everything to stress and trauma, but I've refused every offer, because silence is what they count on, what allows them to prepare in darkness while the world remains ignorant. I know they monitor me, these corporations and government agencies that pretend the supernatural doesn't exist while secretly containing it, and I know they consider me a threat to their carefully maintained illusion of normalcy, but I also know they need people like me, people who have survived encounters and understand the reality they refuse to acknowledge publicly. Last week, I found a business card under my door, expensive cardstock with no name or address, just a phone number and a symbol I recognized from Blackwood's journal. And when I called, a woman's voice simply said, "We know you know, and we know you're preparing, and when the time comes, you won't be alone." Then the line went dead. I choose to take that as hope, that somewhere in the shadows of official denial, there are people working to prevent the next awakening, people with resources and knowledge I lack, people who take the threat seriously and are developing countermeasures, though I wonder sometimes if any human effort can stop something that transcends human understanding. The sun is rising now as I finish writing this account, painting the sky in shades of red that remind me too much of that night, and somewhere in the distance, I can hear church bells ringing, calling people to morning service, and I can't help but think of other bells, silent for now but counting down to their next activation. If you've read this far, if you believe even a fraction of what I've told you, then you have a choice to make. You can dismiss it as the ravings of a traumatized security guard, return to your normal life and hope that the dead stay dead, or you can prepare, can watch for the signs, can be ready when graves begin to open and the barriers between worlds grow thin. I pray you never need this knowledge, that the next window passes without incident, that whatever force Rodriguez unleashed when he destroyed that portal has permanently severed the connection between our world and theirs, but I fear that prayer is not enough, that action will be required, that sacrifice will be demanded. Remember the warning signs: disturbed graves, empty coffins with claw marks, revival bells that ring without cause, temperatures that drop without explanation, and above all, remember that what returns is not what was buried, that death is not always final, and that some things are better left undisturbed. My name is Marcus Chen. I was a graveyard security guard at Evergreen Memorial Cemetery, and I survived the night when the dead stopped being dead, but survival is not the same as escape, and I know that somewhere, in some cemetery, in some specially prepared grave, something waits with infinite patience for its moment to rise. The bells will ring again, of that I am certain, and when they do, when the dead begin their second march, I hope there are those among the living who remember this account, who know what they face and how to fight it, because the war between life and death is not over, it has only just begun, and the next battle will decide the fate of every grave on earth. Until that day comes, I remain watchful, I remain prepared, and I remain haunted by the sound of bells ringing in the darkness, calling the dead to rise and claim a world that was never meant to be theirs, but might become so if we let our guard down, if we forget that some boundaries should never be crossed, and some sleepers should never be awakened.